Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about the growth that online pharmacies in India are expected to see and how they are regulated right now. We will also talk about how a community in Goa got together to save what is perhaps the state's most famous tree. But first, we talk about the COVID-19 situation in India. 6 months after the outbreak of the novel coronavirus epidemic in India, the country has seen over 27 lakh cases and 53,000 deaths. But now, several indicators have begun to suggest that the situation seems to be improving. To understand this, we speak to Amitabh Sinha, a resident editor in Pune, who reports on science and environment for the Indian Express and who has been extensively tracking the coronavirus numbers. And before he talks about the indicators that point to an improvement, he first gives a fair warning and points to a caveat.
And the caveat is that these are just indicators. These are based on numbers that the state government and the central government, they put out every day. And these numbers are not clean, as in the numbers that they put out every day also have data from previous days. So it's all mixed up. So with those kind of caveats in mind, if we look at indicators over a long period, then these indicators do point in a particular direction, and that is what we are trying to do. Now, having said that, there are a few indicators which probably point to a slight improvement in the situation.
So what are these indicators? The first one we look at is the number of new cases that are reported every day, which are now showing some stagnation.
Now, we have been reporting more than 60,000 new infections every day, and we have been doing that for the last almost 2 weeks now, more than 2 weeks, I think. Now, we have spent a longer time in the 60,000s than we have done in the 50,000s or 30,000s or 40,000s. So usually we used to spend, say, about a week in 30,000s or 40,000s and then moved on to the next level. Here in the 60,000s, we have spent more than 2 weeks and we're still there.
Now, this might change tomorrow, but the situation right now is that there is stagnation in the number of cases reported every day. Now, the other indicator is the growth rate, another metric to describe a similar situation.
Now, the daily growth rate of cases had been declining for a pretty long time now, in steady decline. Right now, it is at an all-time low. It's about 2.5% per day. In the last 3 months or 4 months, this is the lowest that we have had.
Moving on to the next indicator, we look at the rate of reproduction, or the R0, which essentially calculates how many more people get infected by an already infected person. For example, if a person infects 2 more people, then the rate is 2.
So R0, again, as of now, is at historic lows, all-time lows in India since the outbreak began. It is very close to 1. It is just about 1.1. And as we have discussed earlier as well, an R value of 1 is supposed to be, some sort of magic number, because once R value goes below that, it's supposed to be the beginning of the decline of the epidemic. Now, again, we have to be a little careful here because the pandemic is still evolving. Usually, R values are more reliably calculated when the epidemic is over, so that you have more reliable estimates of R value. Right now, when the pandemic is still evolving, the R values are just estimates, but still it's a good indication to look at.
The other big indicator is the positivity rate, which is the number of people who test positive out of all the people who are tested. So if 10 people test positive out of 100, then the rate is 10%. And then if the next day you were to test 100 more, and find 5 more positive people, then out of the 200, your total positivity rate will be 7.5%. And now this rate, for the first time since May, has begun to decline. Amitabh explains the possible reasons.
One, of course, it would happen because you are, for the same number of tests, you are actually finding lesser number of people who are positive. Right? So that is a straightforward explanation. But there are other reasons as well why positivity rate can go down. Like what we know of the tests that are being conducted in India, that they are not completely random tests, as in people who are being tested are not being randomly selected.
What is happening in most states is actually targeted testing, which means testing people who are already showing symptoms or are primary contacts of already infected people. So if you are testing these people who are already high risk, you should get a higher positivity rate than if you were to move to randomized testing.
Now, we don't have any evidence to show that states are actually doing that states are moving from targeted testing to more randomized testing. So that reason probably is not being played out here. What is happening, in fact, yes, there has been an increase in the number of testing. Very recently, even at the start of this month, we were testing about 6,000 samples every day. Now we are doing 9 lakh samples per day, right? So there has been an increase in testing. And the conventional wisdom is the more you test, the more positive you will find when the epidemic is still spreading, right? But that doesn't seem to be happening. You are testing more and you are still finding lesser number of people. Now that can happen only if there are actually lesser number of positive people in the population group.
So this is another indicator like the previous ones that points to the fact that the spread of the disease is probably slowing down. Now, another important indicator to understand the outbreak is a serological survey, which is done to assess the prevalence of a disease in a population. In this case, to know, for example, how many people might already have had COVID-19. And the recent sero surveys conducted in Pune, Mumbai, and Delhi actually indicate that the spread has been significantly larger than was earlier estimated. And Amitabh says that this finding that a large number of people already might have contracted COVID-19 and the spread of the disease slowing down, like we discussed earlier, are actually correlated. Let's take the example of the sero survey done in Pune. This survey found out that more than 51% of the participants showed the presence of antibodies for COVID-19, suggesting that they had already been infected at some point.
Now, if we look through that context, what that means is nearly half the population is already infected. Now, if we also take the fact that no case of reinfection has till now been recorded, then what it means is that only the remaining half can now be infected with the disease, right? So if I am, say, interacting with 7 people, at the start of the disease, I can probably transmit the disease to all 7 people because all of them might have been uninfected till then. But at a later stage, when half the population has already been infected, then when I'm interacting with 7 people, then half of them, 3 or 4 of them would already have been infected, right? So I can potentially pass it on to only 3 more people now. So you see, my probability of passing on the transmission decreases, as a result of which there is a slowdown in the transmission rate.
So as more people get infected, the spread of the disease slows down. And right now, serological surveys do indicate that large populations within the country might have already been infected. Now, this mechanism is also how herd immunity is supposed to be achieved. And Amitabh says that we might be approaching that stage, but we need to be careful while talking about herd immunity.
Number one, mainly because we don't even know what is the level of infection from where herd immunity would kick in this particular case. Also, how far or near we are to reaching that stage. So those are still unknown questions, open for exploration, and there are scientists who are working on this, trying to estimate what would be the optimum level of infection from which we can expect herd immunity to start kicking in. But those are open questions. As of now, we really don't know.
The other question that comes to mind is, with so many people already infected, does that mean they are already immune to the virus? Especially considering there hasn't been a single case of reinfection. The only other times people have tested positive again is when there have been traces of virus that still haven't left the body even after recovery. Not enough to harm the body, but enough to get picked up by the test. Amitabh says that this question about immunity is still open for investigation.
When we do the serological tests, what they try to find out, they just see whether you have developed antibodies against this specific disease or not. And if you have the antibodies, then you've had the infection earlier at some point of time. It's a very clear-cut correlation. But the immunity actually comes not just from the antibodies, but a special kind of antibodies within that larger set, which are called neutralizing antibodies. Now, these serological tests are not designed to detect your neutralizing antibodies in your body, right? So now we are in the next stage, and we are already getting into that stage wherein you have researchers and investigators now designing tests to detect the amount of neutralizing antibodies present in your body. And then they would be in a much better position to say whether people who have been infected have also developed immunity, and how many people who have been infected have developed immunity against the disease or not.
But that is yet to happen. Meanwhile, like mentioned earlier, our testing capacity has gone up from a few hundred tests every day to almost a million now. Amitabh points out that testing in the beginning is the best way to contain the spread because when you test and find someone positive, you also isolate them, stop them from spreading the disease. Testing at that stage acts as a containment measure.
So theoretically, if you had tested everyone who had got infected at the start of the outbreak and then isolated the close contacts and isolated these infected people, then theoretically speaking, you would have brought an end to the epidemic. But that did not happen. And now, because there are so many people who already have got infected, and your testing numbers would never be able to keep pace with the growing numbers of infected people. So, as a containment strategy, I think testing would have very limited results now. It's still very important to continue testing in large numbers and continue to isolate people. But this stage where it would have been able to flatten the curve in any significant amount, I think that stage is over. I think now is the stage wherein if what the serological surveys indicate, if there are already like 40% or 50% of the population getting infected, then the growth of the disease would slow down in its natural course as well. And testing would be helping to slow it down further. That is the sort of thing that probably will happen now. That's what we'll see going forward from here.
Dear listeners, sorry for this interruption, but before we move on to the rest of the show, I just wanted your quick attention. One of the big reasons people say they like this show is because it helps them understand the news better. It provides them with the context they need to see the bigger picture. And there is perhaps no other place that does that better than Indian Express's Explained section. We on Three Things refer to the section regularly, and it helps us make this show. If you're a regular reader of Indian Express, you know how useful the Explained section can be, especially when you're looking for in-depth analysis by the right experts. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explained and access the coverage 24/7. Explained by Indian Express, where news that matters is explained by experts who know the subject. Now, back to the show. Next, we talk about online pharmacies. During the COVID-19 crisis, the online pharmacy market in India has continued to grow. Recently, major players like Amazon and Reliance have also shown interest in them. In just last 1 week, India's online pharmacy market saw two significant merger and acquisition deals. Reliance Retail picking up major stake in Chennai-based e-pharmacy NetMeds, and PharmEasy moving to merge with its smaller rival MedLife. In this segment, we first speak to Pranav Mukul, who writes for the Business Bureau for the paper about the online pharmacy market, how it is expected to grow, and the challenges that will come with it. Pranav, in the last week, there have been a number of developments in this market. Could you talk about which are the companies that have so far shown interest in the online pharmacy market?
So there have been a number of companies that have been selling drugs online. There have been startups like 1mg, Practo, Myra, and there have also been traditional pharmacists like Apollo Pharmacy and NetMeds, which started to sell online a couple of years back. But now suddenly there's an elevated interest by larger companies as well. We saw Reliance Industries pick up a majority stake in NetMeds, which is a Chennai-based online pharmacy, and Amazon starting its pharmacy services in Bangalore for now. So there have been traditional players selling online, but now is when we are starting to see some increased interest from companies, large and both small.
And what is the reason we are seeing this sudden, rise in interest? And like, how much does that have to do with the current COVID crisis?
So, what experts have told us is that the online pharmacy market had been poised for growth for a very long time now, because there are a lot of challenges that the physical pharmacists could not solve, where online pharmacies have come into play. So, there have been challenges of reach in a lot of smaller towns and rural areas across India. Physical pharmacists don't have such a strong network. And one thing about India is that, unlike the US or China, we don't have large players controlling a large network of pharmacists. We have a lot of smaller players. So that is some challenge that online pharmacies have been trying to solve at least. And that is what has made experts peg that the online pharmacy market itself is poised to grow sevenfold by 2023 to $2.7 billion in size.
And, we also saw on 50th August, Prime Minister Modi announced the National Digital Health Mission. How much is that supposed to affect this market?
So that certainly will catalyze the whole online healthcare ecosystem, not just online pharmacies, but everything, telemedicine included. But yes, you are right. Once there is an online database of customers and of patients, and once there is a certain level of adaptability within patients to go for online services, it certainly would help companies that are present in the online healthcare ecosystem across the board.
And how much do retail pharmacies contribute to sales in the market?
So retail or traditional pharmacists, they still have a huge chunk of contribution to the sales. Around 85% of India's annual pharmaceutical sales are from retail pharmacists, which means that online pharmacies are still very small in size compared to their traditional counterparts and still have a long way to go.
So right now, if we were to consider offline pharmacies, what edge do they have over online ones?
So it's simply because the online pharmacy sector is still a very nascent sector. The companies haven't scaled up to the extent of their traditional counterparts in size when you look at it on an aggregated basis. And also, when you compare it to other online commerce platforms like, say, online retail, something like a Flipkart or an Amazon, they're still very small companies. And to solve the problems that they are meant to, they will need to become large scale companies, which will require huge investment. And that is what has really triggered the consolidation in the market that we're seeing right now.
Is there an opposition by offline pharmacies right now about this online infrastructure? And will that sort of come in the way of how quickly, the online business will grow?
Like every other online commerce business, whether it be e-retail, whether it be food tech, there has been opposition from brick and mortar chemists. But what is really required for huge investments to come in is laying down of clear regulations, which is currently not there in India. The government had come out with a draft e-pharmacy regulation, but that hasn't really seen light of the day.
E-pharmacies not being regulated is also the reason why they face opposition from brick and mortar chemists. Also, in the absence of such regulation, they cannot stock their own inventory like offline pharmacies can. We speak to Prabha Raghavan, who reports on the pharma sector, about these regulations.
So to start with, because online pharmacies or online sale of medicines, in a sense, doesn't really have any regulations or is not really recognized as of such, right? Because there are no regulations, it is not possible for these guys to operate as an online pharmacy in the truest sense. They're just basically acting like the Amazons or the Flipkarts of the pharmacy space, where they're just collaborating with a lot of these offline retailers who have licenses from the drug regulators to sell their medicines, and they have the right clearances, and they just tie up with these people.
So online pharmacies are essentially operating as marketplaces for ordering medicines from sellers that adhere to the Drugs and Cosmetics Act and rules of India. Currently, different online pharmacies are following different models, but no matter what model they follow, they are not free from the ties they have with online entities. They have to depend on online pharmacies which have the necessary approvals for holding stock. The lack of regulation also raises concerns. Prabha explains how.
Another thing is that because these e-pharmacies are acting like a marketplace, they don't necessarily need approvals from the central or the state drug regulator to sell or to display the medicines that are being sold on their platforms. And, some would say that in a way is also potentially dangerous because, look, it's all then left to the partners that these companies tie up with, and they have to have the necessary approvals in place to sell the products that are being sold on this platform. But then I think on some level, when this happens, if there is an issue with quality of the medicines or anything on that front, the e-pharmacy that is then selling or that is then displaying these medicines on their website is not technically responsible for this mess up.
And in the end, we tell you the story of a tree, a single banyan tree, and how a community in Goa got together to save it. The tree in question is perhaps Goa's most famous one. Smita Nair, who reports on Goa for the paper, tells us that story.
So this place is called The Source. It's also popularly known as Arambol Banyan. A simple Google search will tell you that it's a place where a lot of foreigners come, they dance, and it's always beneath the canopy of the tree. It started 6 years ago, I'm told, when we were interviewing Anna Marcy. She's also a dance conductor or a sort of DJ over there, and she also has her own ceremonies which she performs before any dance performance. They call it the ecstatic dance. It's some sort of movement over there. And people from across the world, when they come to the beach side in the evening around 6, that's when this whole dancing begins over there. It's always underneath the canopy of the banyan tree. That's how it has some sort of a global recall.
The locals, of course, have had a connection to it too. Some come and do yoga there in the morning. Some others sell their tender coconut under its shade. And the 200-year-old tree also has been a home to plenty of birds and animals. But earlier this month, around August 5, there had been a lot of rains accompanied by heavy winds, and the tree couldn't withstand it. After a heavy downpour at night, its regular visitors found it uprooted the next morning.
The first person to see that was definitely the owner of the land in which she stands. It's Sebastiana. And she says she was distraught when she saw that. And there was nothing much they could do because locals also, many of them came to the spot and they said that this must be God's will. And conversations were around that kind. So because there are a lot of foreigners who are stuck now in North Goa, especially around those areas because of the pandemic and because they cannot take commercial flights back home, there is a decent number of foreigners still living in those pockets, I can say. Some of them are doing odd jobs. And one of them actually saw this particular tree fallen down, and that's how the word spread.
Pictures of the uprooted tree spread fast on social media and amongst this group of foreign nationals living in Goa. This is also the time when two groups called the Living Heritage Foundation and Eco Champions got involved and further spread the word.
And because it's a very tourist-friendly pocket of Goa, it already had a lot of appeal to a lot of people who have already traveled to this particular beach. And they have in the past danced beneath this tree. So there was some sort of recall, there was some sort of memory associated with the tree.
They quickly realized that the tree needed help and they needed to set it upright again. But to take on a project like this, they needed money.
So I'm told that the funding came via the campaign that happened, that shaped, and people as far as, Berlin, New York, London, all these major capitals funded through a campaign and the money reached. Now, the bigger issue was also not the money, I would say, because money, I think, was secondary. First was, how do you go about it? Like, how do you get her to stand?
They needed a tree expert. Eventually, they found someone who got in touch with an expert in Hyderabad, Uday Krishna, someone who knew what goes on into rerouting a tree. And he flew down to Goa, free of cost.
And he came with a bunch of his men, and they all decided that because the cranes cannot be brought to the spot because the roads are very narrow, they'll have to go in for some other way to kind of pull her back. I'm told that there was a lot of very, very heated, very emotional debates and discussions that did take shape. And finally, it was decided that they're going to take the help of JCB machines, and they're going to get a couple of them, and they're going to make sure that they pull her back.
JCB machines are much smaller than cranes. They are small-size excavators that draw much less power. Once the JCBs all came to the spot, the locals and foreigners gathered around. The first hurdle came when they realized that the tree was too heavy.
She was like over 100 tons. So they had to actually clip the canopy off. They had to kind of reduce the weight a bit. And I think somewhere in the morning, between 11 and to noon, they were doing all these kinds of permutations on understanding where to take the rope from and what is the level that they should be pulling her up from. It was a long wait, I would say, from 7:30 in the morning when these guys were already on the spot till 3 o'clock when she was finally lifted. And towards the end, towards the last 2 hours, it was quite tricky. It was also like tempers were flaring a bit in the middle because they were not getting the grip. They were not understanding where to pull her up from. There was a snake which was there in her trunk, which was also creating a bit of a problem. Like I remember the operators were having a bit of a task, like to kind of, not just go around the tree, but also go around where she was. So all was interesting. But finally, I think it was at one particular moment when the main operator, Nandan, he decided that there was a particular angle that he figured was the best one. And then he pushed this machine, which is called the bull backhoe loader. And he kind of also got the support of the other 3 JCBs. And there was so much of excitement when the tree finally started moving, because till then the tree wasn't moving. And then finally, inch by inch, she started getting up. There were like a lot of whistles. There were people who were like cheering. Dogs were going around, wagging their tails. And it was really high excitement. And in the end, finally, when she stood up, I looked at Sebastiana and she actually had a small prayer offered. And then later when I went to her, she was very sweet. She kept repeating to everyone, I thought, Banyan not get up, Banyan not get up. I thought that was really something for her to kind of emotionally have that outburst. But in the end, everything worked out fine. And these people were also recording it in live. There were a lot of people who were watching it live. There was this one person who told me that she's actually showing it live to her sister somewhere in Berlin. So it's beautiful. I mean, it's community effort. And Uday, tree expert, has to be really congratulated. And also, what was interesting is the JCB operators. They spoke so passionately about it. They said that they have been using these machines for destruction all their life. And this was the first time they've actually used it for something like this.
Uday, the tree expert, told Smita that it would take around 2 more weeks for the tree to gain ground again. One reason they found that may have contributed to the tree being uprooted was the ecstatic dancing that would take place around it, making the roots loose. Ironically, the very thing that got these people together and has now resulted in the tree being set up right again.
And Uday is taking some sort of training and tutoring today of the locals, making them appreciate that the roots need to be kind of rescued as well. And the tree will need all the support. And it's not just this whole effort of getting money and getting cranes and putting her back standing. Now is the real task when all the locals, all the foreigners, and everyone who's had some sort of memory associated with her have to put in their best to make sure that she's always standing.
Smita says that this story means a lot to the locals and environmental activists in the region who have been facing one defeat after the other. This includes several trees being axed for an airport to come up in North Goa.
While it is important, people do understand that these kind of infrastructure projects do have some sort of commercial sense in it. But there needs to be an equal emphasis on environment, which is lacking in Goa. The other thing that is absolutely high on the agenda right now in Goa is that there are 3 big projects which are coming, and there are litigations which are already shaping. Now, close to 1 lakh trees are expected to be axed if these 3 projects do get clearance. Now, these are projects which involve expansion of highway, which are going to come via the Western Ghats. Then there is another railway track, which is again going to come from the Western Ghats. And the third one is a power project, which the government is pitching as a very important need for the state if you're looking at power demands in the next decade or so. But what is missing is some sort of taking the community into confidence, trying to make them understand that maybe there's another way where we can look at transplanting it. There is no will that has been shown from the government side, which is what the people tell us. In that scenario, when you as a state stand to lose so many trees and where you feel helpless about it, just the very fact that people from across the globe in the middle of a pandemic, and especially at a time like this when every news is negative, just the fact that people came together to get her up in a very remote corner in Goa is something beautiful.
It cost them 2 lakh rupees to get the tree up. Environmentalists like Avatina Miranda and Caroline Colasso are now writing to the Chief Minister asking him to keep funds for such projects ready.
The second most important thing that there's some sort of awareness is that many Goans have now decided to go to Hyderabad or go to wherever these tree experts exist and learn from them on how to do a transplant. Because mostly the belief always was you need the government to help you to transplant. But this one symbolic, simple exercise has shown that all you need is community will.
You were listening to 3 Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav, and as always was edited and mixed by our producer, Joshua Thomas. Before we go, here's another reminder to check out Indian Express's Explain section. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explain and find in-depth analysis by the right experts. It has everything you need to know to understand the news better and see the bigger picture. If you like this show, then you can subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.